Edinburgh's air carries a particular weight, as if the stones in its alleyways still held the size of the past. When evening falls, the clouds turn pearl grey, and over the hill of the old town, the wind brings the cold scent of moss and recent rain. In that ancient heart, where footsteps echo over cobblestones and the distant strains of bagpipes drift through the air, a dark iron gate stands tall. Behind its bars, Greyfriars Kirkyard stretches out like a fold in time, frozen in place. It is a place of rest and remembrance, but also of whispers. Among the cypresses, the leaning gravestones, and the lichen-covered mausoleums, a visitor can feel that the city never truly sleeps. Greyfriars is not just a cemetery. It is a witness to centuries of faith, struggle, and souls that refuse to disappear. History says the ground was consecrated in 1562 on what had once been the Garden of the Grey Friars, the Franciscan monks from whom it took its name. As Scotland made its way into the Reformation, the convent walls fell, but the earth remained silent, and the hill became the burial ground of Edinburgh's citizens. Over the years, merchants, clergymen, craftsmen, poets, doctors, and entire families came to rest there. The stones of the kirkyard rose one over another, and the centuries covered them with stories of love, plague, war, and old superstition. Yet among all the graves of Greyfriars, there is one that never ceased to be visited. A grey stone tomb, sturdy and sombre, where the name of Sir George Mackenzie was carved in solemn letters beneath a pediment crowned with skulls and extinguished torches. Locals call it Mackenzie's Prison, or the Black Mausoleum, and some prefer not to look at it for too long. George Mackenzie was born in the 17th century, when Scotland was torn apart by the religious conflicts that shaped an entire age. He was a man of law, educated, eloquent, and ambitious. He studied in Aberdeen and later in Paris, where he mastered the arts of reasoning and rhetoric. Under Charles II, his intelligence won him royal favour, and he was soon appointed Lord Advocate, Scotland's chief prosecutor. But fate decreed that his name would be bound forever, not to his writings, but to fear. During his tenure, he was tasked with crushing the Covenanter uprisings, the Presbyterian faithful who refused to accept the religious authority imposed by the king. To some, Mackenzie was a servant of order and law. To others, he was a merciless executioner. In the chronicles of the time, he is remembered as Bluidy Mackenzie, Bloody Mackenzie, for the brutality with which he pursued dissenters. The Pentland Hills and the fields of Bothwell Bridge saw much blood spilled in those years, and when the surviving prisoners were brought to Edinburgh, Mackenzie ordered them confined on a patch of barren ground beside the cemetery, a kind of open-air detention camp enclosed by walls. That place became known as the Covenanters' Prison. For months, hundreds of men were held there, exposed to cold, rain, and hunger. Some died beneath the winter sky. Others were deported or executed. The wind that moved between the crosses and the walls carried the sound of their prayers. And from then on, the cemetery seemed to change its tone. In time, Mackenzie died and was buried paradoxically, only a few steps from the prison he himself had ordered built. His mausoleum, raised with solemn grandeur, seemed to seal a pact between stone and silence. No one knows whether it was coincidence or the irony of fate, but his tomb remained so close to the suffering of those he had condemned that many believed his spirit would never find rest. Centuries passed. Time, which wears everything down, left in Greyfriars an ancient beauty. Lichen clung to the slabs, Ivy climbed the walls, and tourists began wandering among the epitaphs, searching for names and legends. For a long time, Mackenzie's mausoleum was just another curiosity in the cemetery, an imposing but silent work of funerary architecture, until, at the end of the 20th century, that silence broke. It was on an afternoon in 1998 when a visitor, seeking shelter from the rain, pushed open the old door of the mausoleum. Inside, it smelled of dampness and old stone. The half-light sketched shadows between columns and dust. They say the man stumbled over something and fell to the ground. When he tried to get back up, the stone slab had shifted, revealing a dark hollow beneath the floor. There, among fragments of coffins and ancient remains, something, no one knows what, seemed to move. The visitor fled screaming. From that day on, the stories began. People who felt invisible shoves, scratches appearing on skin, a freezing gust that suddenly swirled out of nowhere. Others claimed they heard breathing beside their ears, even in broad daylight. Some cemetery caretakers refused to pass near the mausoleum after nightfall. The rumor spread, and the legend woke again. The spirit of Bluidy Mackenzie, they said, had been disturbed, and now rose against the living, as if still defending his ground or punishing anyone bold enough to interrupt his sleep. But the mystery of Greyfriars has more than one face. For some insist it is not Mackenzie who wanders there, but the souls of the Covenanters, those who suffered in the nearby prison. Perhaps their buried rage mingled with the memory of the king's lawyer, and from that collision of memories, something new was born. An echo, a tremor, a presence. From then on, Greyfriars Kirkyard became a pilgrimage site for the curious and for seekers of the unseen. Some arrived with cameras, others with incense, others only with respect and silence. And though the guides tell the story in calm, measured voices, none of them can avoid feeling the weight of that cold air rising over the hill when night begins to cover Edinburgh. Even so, there is a strange calm in the place. The cemetery, with all its melancholy beauty, remains a refuge for thought. Among the gravestones, one can imagine the passing of centuries, hear the murmur of forgotten prayers, feel the nearness of history still alive within the stones. The days go by, and visitors leave flowers, coins, and small offerings. Some claim that if one speaks to him respectfully, the lawyer's spirit remains calm, as if time itself had softened his memory. Perhaps deep down, Mackenzie was not a monster, but a man of his age, trapped between law and passion, between justice and obedience to power. And perhaps what haunts Greyfriars today is not a vengeful ghost, but the lingering echo of a violent century in which faith and politics were fused into the same wound. That is Edinburgh's paradox, a city where history does not hide, but breathes. To walk through its alleyways at dusk is to hear an ancient language made of stone, rain, and memory. And at the heart of that voice, the name of Mackenzie still beats on, like a shadow that, more than frightening, invites us to remember. The dawn over Greyfriars carries a very different shade from dawn in other places. When the first light touches the crosses and the ivy-covered walls, the cemetery seems to awaken with a breath of its own. Dense, low-lying mist slips between the gravestones like a cotton veil, and the distant sound of the city barely reaches that place at all. At that hour, the caretakers begin their silent rounds. One of them, an older man named Angus MacLaren, has spent more than 30 years tending that ground. He knows every corner, every crack in the ancient slabs. Angus says the cemetery has memory, Not the memory of books, but something deeper, something that lives in stone and wind. Sometimes when the fog thickens and the silence stretches out, he feels greyfriars murmuring, not like a lament, but like a reminder, a faint brush of time refusing to pass entirely away. It was Angus who, years ago, tried to keep the door of Mackenzie's mausoleum shut after the incidents of the 1990s. Reports of people fainting, being scratched, or simply leaving in terror had multiplied. And yet he never spoke of spirits in a fearful tone. To him, what happened there was a dialogue between what had been and what still remained. The dead do not harm us, he used to say, but they do remember. And perhaps he was right, because every so often, the wind that sweeps down from Edinburgh Castle brushes the treetops of the cemetery, and the sound resembles a sigh. Anyone who pauses for a moment can swear they hear ancient names, half-erased prayers, or the voice of a city bidding farewell to itself, and then finding itself once more. As one goes deeper into Mackenzie's story, it becomes impossible to separate the man from the age that shaped him. The 17th century was a turbulent time in Scotland. The Reformation had divided souls, and royal power was fighting to impose its creed. The Covenanters, men and women who had sworn loyalty to their Presbyterian faith, defied the king's authority by refusing to accept bishops imposed by the crown. In that crossfire, Mackenzie acted as the lawyer of the king's law. The chronicles say he was a cultivated man, even refined. He loved books and wrote treatises on philosophy and jurisprudence. One of them, a moral essay preferring solitude to public employment, defended inner peace over worldly power. There lies the irony of his fate, a man who wrote about spiritual serenity, yet in life was feared as an enforcer of royal severity. The Covenanters captured after the defeat at Bothwell Bridge were his last great cause. In 1679, close to 1,200 prisoners were brought to Edinburgh. The government needed a place to hold them, and Mackenzie ordered the ground beside Greyfriars to be made ready. There, out in the open, surrounded by high walls and given little more than meager rations, the men remained for months. Winter rain fell over them, and the mud mingled with hunger and despair. Many died right there, and their bodies were buried in mass graves within the same enclosure. From then on, the place was known as the Covenanters' Prison. Today, anyone walking through that part of the cemetery feels something different beneath their feet. The ground is uneven, softer somehow, and the silence seems deeper. There are no statues there, no ornaments, only grass and wind. When Angus guides visitors, he often stops there for a few minutes. He asks them to listen. The murmur of the city fades, and for one moment, the past seems only a step away. This ground remembers, he says in a low voice. And if Mackenzie still wanders, perhaps it is because he never learned how to ask forgiveness. The figure of Mackenzie's poltergeist grew over the years, blending fact, superstition, and tourism. Municipal records contain more than 200 complaints from visitors who claim to have suffered incidents near the mausoleum. Dizziness, sudden falls, unexplained marks on the skin, or the feeling of being shoved. No one could offer a convincing explanation. Some psychologists attributed the events to mass suggestion. Others pointed to magnetic variations beneath the ground. But the truth is that even with modern lights and cameras, the guides still found something unsettling in the air. One night in 2004, a group of paranormal investigators was granted permission to spend the night inside the cemetery. They set up microphones, thermal cameras, and motion sensors. For the first few hours, nothing happened. Only the drip of rain over leaves, the echo of footsteps, and the whisper of wind through the iron gates. At midnight, one of the sensors registered a slight fluctuation in temperature beside Mackenzie's mausoleum. The air dropped suddenly to 3 degrees below zero, while the rest of the cemetery remained mild. The cameras captured no figures and no clear sound, but one microphone picked up a faint voice, almost a moan, like a breath pronouncing a single word: mercy. The recording was analyzed for weeks. Some said it was wind interference. Others believed they heard in that word an echo from the past. Whatever the case, the myth of the poltergeist was sealed into place. But even among its darkest stories, Greyfriars keeps its beauty. The cemetery is ringed by the old streets of Edinburgh, and from certain points one can see the silhouette of the castle watching over the hill. Night tours have become part of the city's charm, and the guides with their lanterns and low, grave voices tell the stories with an almost poetic tone. They do not seek to frighten. They seek to convey the feeling of walking along the border of time. Sometimes an owl crosses the damp air in silence. The candles some visitors leave before the tombs flicker in the breeze, and their glow creates shapes that seem to move. In that moment, fear dissolves into a kind of reverence. For there, under the moss-covered earth, rest centuries of Scottish history. Angus often stays late, even after the groups have gone. On winter nights, when the air grows so cold that fingers lose their feeling, he walks among the mausoleums with an oil lantern. Sometimes he stops in front of Mackenzie's tomb. He rests his hand on the stone and murmurs words that only he understands. He has never said what he feels in those moments, but some say that by dawn he always leaves a dried flower at the entrance to the mausoleum. A rose almost every time, perhaps as an offering, perhaps as a gesture of peace. With the passing of the years, the story of the poltergeist ceased to be merely an urban legend and became instead a reflection of Edinburgh's collective memory. Mackenzie, the Covenanters, the cemetery and its visitors form a chain of echoes stretching from the 17th century to the present day. And though the word poltergeist evokes movement and noise, what persists at Greyfriars is something else entirely. A thick silence filled with meaning. Because perhaps there are no spirits shoving the living, no shadows striking out, but only the weight of a story that has still not finished being told. Across the centuries, Greyfriars Kirkyard has watched generations of Edinburgh's people come and go. Each left a trace behind: wilted flowers, copper coins, epitaphs inscribed by careful hands. But what one breathes there, even more than the smell of wet earth, is the sense of permanence. Cities change, they modernize, raise buildings, erase roads. And yet Greyfriars remains the same, a refuge of stillness in the middle of life's constant murmur. That is why it is no surprise that visitors crossing its iron gate, even those who come out of curiosity or with a hunger for mystery, end up lowering their voices. The atmosphere imposes itself. The shadows of the mausoleums seem to move gently with the passing clouds, and the sound of the wind through the old trees mingles with the distant chime of St. Giles's bells. Among all the places in Edinburgh, few preserve the flavour of the past, the way Greyfriars does. On grey days, the sky and the stone melt into a single tone. On clear days, Sunlight filters through the branches, gilding the names carved into the grave markers. And on moonlit nights, the cemetery becomes another world entirely, a kingdom of marble, moss, and silence. Mackenzie, in life, was a man of contrasts. Some describe him as a brilliant jurist, even a reformer of Scottish law. Others paint him as an instrument of power, incapable of compassion. In his own day, he was not regarded as a monster, but as a servant of order. Yet history, with its long memory, does not forget the suffering of the weak, and the name Bluidy Mackenzie ended up weighing more than any legal treatise he ever wrote. They say that before his death in 1691, the lawyer withdrew from public life and spent his final years in writing and meditation. He had a house near the High Street, where it is said he spent his nights by candlelight, rereading the Psalms and the moral writings he had composed in his youth. Some witnesses from the time claimed that shortly before his death, he asked to be buried in sacred ground, among the righteous and those who suffered. His words may have been nothing more than the formal piety of a religious man, but the fact that he was buried right beside the Covenanters' prison has stirred every kind of interpretation for centuries. Was it, perhaps, an attempt at atonement, or the final irony of fate, a symbolic punishment for the man who had condemned so many? Whatever the truth, when his body was placed inside that black stone mausoleum, no one imagined that 300 years later his name would be invoked, not as that of a jurist, but as that of a spirit. During the 18th century, the cemetery continued to grow. Entire families raised mausoleums beside Mackenzie's, and the place filled with allegorical sculptures. Angels with stern faces, winged skulls, winged hourglasses reminding the living how fleeting time is. The Romantic era turned death into a form of beauty, and Greyfriars became both a place of mourning and a garden for silent walks. Edinburgh's poets came there in search of inspiration. Robert Ferguson, for example, was buried within its walls, and a young Robert Burns came to honor him, leaving flowers and a poem. In the calm of Greyfriars, the boundary between life and death seemed to blur, and ghost stories were less a matter of terror than a poetic way of speaking about the past. Yet, in the modern decades, when the phenomena around the mausoleum multiplied, something changed. The guards, reluctant at first, began shutting down the night visits. Later, the city of Edinburgh fenced off the Covenanters' prison area, and for a time access was forbidden. But public fascination was impossible to contain. Every closure, every new warning drew more people. Tour groups and curiosity seekers multiplied, and the legends began to swell. It was said that the attacks of Mackenzie's poltergeist could cause fainting, choking sensations, or invisible blows. Some local newspapers published sensationalist pieces, and the figure of the old Lord Advocate was transformed into an icon of Scottish mystery. And yet, those who truly know the cemetery, the guides, historians, and caretakers, understand that Greyfriars is not a place of terror. It is a place of memory, a mirror of the Scottish soul. One autumn afternoon, a historian named Fiona Dunn began investigating the origins of the myth with the intention of writing a book. She spent months combing through archives, reading 17th century letters, court records, diaries, and ecclesiastical registers. Little by little, she came to understand that Mackenzie's figure was wrapped in a fog of contradictions. In contemporary texts, he appeared as a devout, cultivated man, even generous to those in his circle who were in need. But in the memoirs of the Covenanters, His name was a synonym for persecution and pain. Fiona understood that both portraits could be true. The jurist and the inquisitor, the philosopher and the official, the man who spoke of virtue and the one who enforced the law with severity. When she visited the mausoleum for the first time, she did so at dawn. The sun was only just beginning to rise over the hill, and the air was filled with that mixture of dampness and the scent of earth that defines Edinburgh. As she approached, she noticed that the stones of the mausoleum seemed to breathe. Not literally, of course, but with that silent vibration possessed by places heavy with history. Fiona placed a hand on the cold stone and closed her eyes. She imagined the man resting there, his thoughts, his guilt, his achievements, his silences. And she felt that beyond the legend, there was a human tragedy. Time, she thought, can turn anyone into a ghost. Sometimes wandering is not even necessary. It is enough to be remembered in a way that no longer belongs to us. From then on, her research changed direction. She decided not to focus on paranormal phenomena, but on the relationship between memory and forgiveness. Because if anything beats in the heart of Greyfriars Kirkyard, it is precisely that. The eternal conversation between those who were and those who remain. When one looks at Mackenzie's mausoleum at sunset, with its rounded dome and soot-darkened stone columns, it is impossible not to feel respect. Not so much from fear, but from what it represents. It is a capsule of centuries, a reminder that every stone, every name, every human story leaves traces that time never quite erases. Perhaps after all, the so-called poltergeist is not a presence seeking to frighten, but a manifestation of the energy born from collective remembrance, an echo of guilt and repentance, of pain and understanding. Because, as the elders of Edinburgh say, the dead only speak when the living forget to listen. And Greyfriars, more than a cemetery, is exactly that, a place where people still listen. With time, the story of Mackenzie's poltergeist became more than a tale of strange events. It turned into a living legend that reflected Scotland's contradictory soul, that blend of reason and mysticism, of deep faith and respect for the mysteries of the unseen world. The people of Edinburgh, accustomed to living beside the shadows of their history, learned to look at Greyfriars with a mixture of pride and reverence. There, among the moss-covered tombs, political history, devotion, tragedy, and poetry intertwine. Fiona Dunn, the historian who had devoted her days to unraveling Mackenzie's figure, began visiting the cemetery often. She went at different times of day. At dawn, when the bells of St. Giles marked the start of the morning, or at dusk when the sun disappeared behind the mist rising from Grassmarket. Sometimes she sat on one of the stone benches, notebook resting on her lap, watching the wind move through the branches and the light change over the epitaphs. On one occasion, while she sat there, she heard the slow footsteps of Angus MacLaren, the old caretaker. He greeted her with a nod and stopped beside her. "You come here often, Miss Dunn," he said in his deep, drawn-out voice. "You're nearly part of the landscape now." She smiled without taking her eyes off the mausoleum. "I never get tired of looking at it," she replied. "It's strange. Every time it seems different." Angus nodded slowly. "The stones change with the light, but also with the person looking at them. Here, you don't just see, you listen." They sat in silence for a while. The air was cold and smelled of wet soil. "Do you believe in the poltergeist story?" Fiona asked at last. Angus sighed. "That depends on what you mean by believe," If you ask me whether there's a furious spirit striking visitors, I'll tell you I don't know. But if you ask me whether this place holds energy, memory, that's something different. A great deal of weeping has happened here, and wherever there's been that much pain, something always remains suspended. Fiona closed her notebook. Perhaps that something is only our need to understand. The old man smiled faintly. Perhaps, or perhaps the soul of a place is like a mirror. It reflects whatever we carry inside. In the months that followed, Fiona began writing her book. She did not title it Mackenzie's Poltergeist, but The Soul of Greyfriars. In it, she recounted not only the story of the king's lawyer and the Covenanters, but also the evolution of the cemetery as a place of memory. She described how, after wars and reforms, the people of Edinburgh turned that sacred ground into a symbol of resistance and identity. Perhaps the true spirit that dwells among these stones, she wrote, is neither Mackenzie's nor that of the Presbyterian martyrs, but Scotland's itself, proud, tragic, and serene before time. The book was published several years later and was praised by historians and readers alike. Many highlighted its quiet tone, its ability to join past and present without relying on fear, but on reverence. Fiona continued visiting Greyfriars, though no longer as a researcher, but as a friend of the place. She often encountered tourists who, without recognizing her, repeated lines from her book while walking its paths. Some spoke with restrained emotion, others with curiosity, but all lowered their voices as they approached Mackenzie's mausoleum. There was something in that collective silence that transformed fear into contemplation. One winter morning, as Edinburgh woke beneath a thick fog, Fiona returned to the cemetery, carrying a bundle of heather, Scotland's flower, and laid it over the railing of the mausoleum. The air was icy, and the ground crunched under her boots. There was no one else there. The city seemed suspended, as if time itself had stopped. She approached slowly, breathing in the metallic scent of winter. Through the bars, she could see the dark interior, the columns coated in dust, and the stone arch above the sarcophagus. She felt no fear, not even unease, but a deep peace, as if the place, despite its reputation, received her kindly. She laid a hand on the railing and whispered, "Everyone has heard you now, Mackenzie. Rest." The wind blew softly then, stirring the branches overhead. A dry leaf fell at her feet, spinning slowly before settling on the ground. Fiona smiled and walked away. Angus watched her leave from a distance. The old guardian, cap tilted and dark coat wrapped close, stared at the mausoleum for a long moment before stepping nearer. He placed his lantern on the ground and lit a small candle in a side niche. The orange glow illuminated the carved skulls and urns decorating the entrance. "We all need forgiveness," he murmured, "even those who enforce the law." He left the candle burning and slowly walked away. As he passed, the wind lifted a murmur through the trees. It was hard to tell whether it was only air or something more, but in the dimness of the cemetery, the echo seemed to speak a single word. It was not fear nor guilt. It was a softer word, barely audible: silence. Today, Greyfriars remains one of the most visited places in Scotland. The night tours continue, though with a more respectful tone than in years past. The guides tell Mackenzie's story not as a warning, but as a meditation on justice and redemption. Visitors listen, walk slowly, and many leave flowers or handwritten letters, asking peace for the dead and comfort for the living. In the colder months, snow covers the gravestones like a mantle of purity. In spring, daffodils bloom between the stones and bring colour to corners that were once all grey. And in summer, when Scotland's sky turns pale blue, children play in the nearby park without fear, as if time had finally scarred over every wound. Perhaps that, in the end, is what the story of Mackenzie's Poltergeist truly means. Not a tale of horror, but a journey toward understanding. A metaphor for the human soul, capable of causing pain, yet also capable of redemption across the centuries. Because the silence of Greyfriars is not the silence of fear, but the silence of memory. And in that stillness, beneath the cypresses and the low Edinburgh clouds, the old names rest at last in peace. The phantom piper of Clanyard Bay. The southwest wind blew over the cliffs of Galloway with winter's weary voice. At that hour, when the sun dimmed behind the hills, the sea looked like burnished tin, and the waves broke with a deep, almost human murmur. In Clanyard Bay, where the water curves into the shore like an embrace, ruins covered in lichen stood watch. The remains of an old tower that had once guarded the passage of Norse ships and wandering fishermen. In that place, according to the village elders, the distant notes of bagpipes could still sometimes be heard. They were not merry tunes, but long, melancholic tones that seemed to rise from the rocks themselves, or from some deep grotto hidden by the sea. No one knew exactly where they came from, but everyone in Clanyard Bay knew the name attached to that echo, the Phantom Piper. The wind carried his music across the waves when the fog rolled in thick, and the sailors' dogs whimpered uneasily, as if they recognized a spirit wandering without rest. In the nearby taverns by the warmth of a peat fire, the fishermen told the story again and again, always in low voices and with a glass of whiskey in hand. They said that centuries ago, when Clanyard Castle still stood, a young piper named Ewan MacRae lived there. He had been born in the inland hills, in a valley where the heather blooms purple every autumn, and from childhood he showed an extraordinary gift for music. His father, a shepherd, had taught him the first tunes, but it was an old traveller who gave him the bagpipe that changed his fate. A black bagpipe, adorned with polished bone rings and a small inscription in Gaelic that no one had ever fully translated. Ewan had won everyone's affection at the castle. He played at weddings, at feasts, at the farewells of ships, and even the warriors fell silent to listen to him. But there was something strange in his music, a nuance that seemed older than he was, an echo that did not fully belong to the world of the living. One night, a rumor began to spread among the fishermen. Beneath the cliffs, in the very bay of Clanyard, secret tunnels opened into sea caves. Some believed the Scythe, the spirits of the hills and guardians of forgotten treasures, dwelled in those caves. Others said they were only hiding places for smugglers and vanished sailors. The lord of the castle, curious and reckless, ordered the grottos explored. But no one dared go farther than the first bend, where the air turned damp and cold, and the sound of the waves thundered like the breathing of some vast creature. Only Ewan, driven by youth and pride together, offered to go in. "If there are spirits," he said with a smile, "perhaps a little music will calm them." The men laughed nervously. They tied a rope around his waist, handed him a torch, and watched him descend the rocky path to the cave mouth. The wind snuffed out the flames, and the sea licked the stones with white foam. Then the bagpipe began to play. It was a steady melody, moving at a slow pace, climbing up the rocks like a prayer. Those waiting above listened in wonder, hearing the sound drift farther and farther away, as if Ewan were advancing through the tunnels. Then the echo changed. The notes grew sharper, more wandering, as if something deep below were answering him. The rope trembled in the men's hands, and then went slack. The wind roared, the sea surged in a single instant and crashed against the cliff walls. When everything calmed again, the rope was cut, and the bagpipe was still playing far away, far below. No one ever saw young Ewan McGray again. From that day on, the foggy nights brought back that same music. Sometimes it sounded sorrowful. Other times, it felt like a lament. The fisherman said it was Ewan, still playing in the tunnels, still searching for the way out, or perhaps guarding whatever secret he found down there. Centuries later, when the castle had become nothing more than ruins, and the McRae descendants had scattered, a young woman named Mairin arrived in Clanyard. She was a music student from Glasgow. She had heard the legend as a child, told by her grandmother, who used to say to her, "If you ever hear bagpipes in the mist, don't be afraid. It is only Ewan greeting you from the other side of time." Mairin was curious, dreamy, and always carried a small wooden flute with her. She had come to Clanyard to collect old melodies from the region, songs that were disappearing into the wind off the sea. She stayed in a little white cottage facing the bay, where the sound of the waves was a constant sigh. The first days were quiet. She walked along the shore gathering seashells, writing down fragments of songs she heard from the old fishermen, and playing as the sun went down. But one night, as she was writing by the fire, a sound woke her. At first it was soft, barely more than a murmur, but unmistakable. Bagpipes. It was not a recording, nor a distant radio. It was something coming from outside, from the sea. She rose, opened the window, and the cold Atlantic breeze brushed her face. Through the mist rising from the water, the melody floated clearly, slow, melancholic, beautiful. A chill ran through her, not from fear, but from recognition. That music, she thought, seemed to be calling her by name. The next day, Marian went into the village to ask about it. The old men at the harbor looked at her cautiously. One of them, a white-bearded man named Fergus, said, "So, you heard it, did you? Then you know it's no story for tourists." Marian nodded. "Has anyone ever tried to find him?" Fergus shook his head. "They tried once many years ago. They never came back. Those caves aren't for the living, lass. They're full of passages that change with the tide. Some say beneath them there's a road leading to the realm of the Seath." But Myron's curiosity was stronger than fear. That afternoon she went down alone to the bay, when the tide was low and the sun painted the wet rocks gold. She found the cave entrance half covered in seaweed and sand. The air coming from it was cold, smelling of salt and soaked stone. She took out her flute and blew a soft note. The sound vanished at once, swallowed by the darkness. Then, very far away, something answered. A faint bagpipe note, like a sleeping echo. Myron's heart beat faster. Without thinking, she stepped inside. The first step was short and uncertain. Her eyes needed time to adjust to the half-light, and for a few moments she could see nothing but damp glimmers. The light from outside, filtering through the entrance, cast a spray of reflections across the stone. The ceiling was low, and the murmur of the sea became here a deep breathing sound, as if the cave were asleep, exhaling its salty breath. She lifted the flute again, and this time she played a small motif. 3 rising notes, a pause, and a fourth lower note, like someone gently knocking at a door. The answer took its time. It came like a thread of smoke, fine and almost impossible. A single long bagpipe note, sustained, descending just slightly, like a gesture of assent. Myrene closed her eyes and let herself be guided by that invisible voice. She moved forward 2 more careful steps, testing the ground with the tip of her boot. The stone was slick, but solid. She felt the air grow colder. The torch the men of old would have carried had been replaced by a small handheld lantern, and its dim light bent itself around the drops hanging from the ceiling like little crystal bells. She did not want to go too far. She had promised herself that. She would only play a few notes, listen, and then return to the shelter of the fading afternoon. But the sound drew her onward, not urgently, not insistently. It drew her the way the smell of freshly baked bread draws you toward an unfamiliar house, like a sincere invitation without pressure. She took another step, heard the delicate crunch of sand under her boot, saw on the wall a strand of dried seaweed shaped like a rune, and then the music swelled again. It was not a full melody. It came in fragments, loose threads of an ancient air. The bagpipe wept in that tone like nothing else in the world. Skin and wind, like a bell. Hillside breath made into a voice. Myrene listened carefully and realized the notes did not move in a straight line. They moved in circles, as if someone were walking around an invisible chamber, testing strings of light hanging from the caverns over the roof. Each time the bagpipe shifted key, the echo gave back a different color. A solitary note became, through the work of stone, 3 or 4 shadow siblings. Ewan, Myrene whispered, without realizing she had spoken. If it's you, just play what you remember. I'll follow. Her lantern revealed a bend and a small pool. The water was still. On its surface, like a mirror, it held the distant cave mouth and the sliver of sky still lending the place its faint light. Myrene knelt, touched the water with 2 fingers, and the cold went through her as deeply as slow-falling snow at the edge of a forest. She lifted the flute and repeated her 3 opening notes. This time, instead of waiting, she continued with a variation learned from her grandmother. A little lullaby they used to hum when rain beat against slate roofs. The bagpipe answered, not identically. It introduced a passing note that was not in the lullaby, and that tiny detail was enough to ignite a memory. Myrene felt her skin rise in goose flesh. Her grandmother, sitting by the fire, singing softly, and sometimes when the lullaby was almost over, adding that same fleeting note, as if someone had once taught it to her and she had decided to keep it for herself, alone. Una volta, she would say, a small turn to close the door of sleep. Where had her grandmother found that little flower of music? Myrene breathed deeply. The cave seemed to have felt her emotion too, because the echo grew softer, warmer. Thank you, Myrene said, without knowing to whom she was speaking. I'm here. I don't mean to disturb anything. I only want to hear you. The passage now opened in 2 directions. To the left, the ground sloped closer to sea level, and the air smelled of fresh salt and seaweed. To the right, the stone rose upward, and the scent changed. Damp peat, old fuel from vanished fires. The bagpipe, with a breath that was almost a sigh, leaned toward the right. Myrene obeyed. She walked slowly, marking each step with the beam of her lantern. She found marks on the wall, simple incisions, small lines softened by time. A tally, perhaps, she thought, of how many times someone had passed there, or a crude way of remembering the road. She brushed one of the marks with the back of her fingers. The stone felt warm at that point, as if it still held the heat of a hand that had touched it only moments before. The music changed. It was the same air, but older in the way it spoke. Myrene could not understand how she could know something she had never heard, and yet her body felt the logic of the notes. It was as if there were a secret genealogy of melodies, a family buried beneath layers of time, and the bagpipe was calling her by an invisible surname. She climbed a little higher. In that part of the tunnel, the ceiling opened enough for the lantern to reveal hidden colors in the rock. Green stains of moss, bluish threads, and in one corner a cluster of calcified shells, gathered like a small bouquet. Drops fell in their own rhythm, marking time like a slow clock. She stopped so as not to lose herself. Her breathing was quicker now, not from effort, but from emotion. She let the flute hang from the ribbon around her neck and pressed her palm to the wall. The bagpipe spoke again, now from beyond the next bend. It was impossible, she thought, for a person to fit there, because the sound came from a place that could not be reached without turning. And yet it felt as near as the breath of someone blowing out a candle beside her. Myrene did not like sudden shocks. Music, too, suffers from haste. So she closed her eyes for a moment and gave her human voice a small task. If you are Ewan, I'm listening. If you're not, I'm listening too. I'm not here to demand anything. I only wanted to know whether you were truly here. Then the bagpipe held a long drone, as if an unseen arm had drawn back a curtain. Behind that drone came 3 measures that felt like a welcome. Myrene repeated them on her flute, then added the smallest trill, like the laugh of a swallow. The answer took her trill, placed it at the end of the 2nd measure, and repeated it 2 more times. It was a game, she realized. A delicate game for 2 musicians who could not see one another. And there, in the heart of the cave, playing with the air, time lost its fingers. When at last she rounded the bend, she found a chamber larger than she had imagined. The ceiling was filled with petrified roots, as if a forest hung upside down inside the stone. Through a hollow above, green watery light fell into the room, and a thin thread of water dropped silently into a natural basin. On the far wall, someone had pressed shells, crystals, and bits of pottery into the stone, shaping spirals. It was not the work of chance. Myrene moved closer, fascinated, and saw how the spirals linked one to the next in a dance that led toward the center. And in that center, a smooth, empty circle polished by hands and years. There, just in front of that circle, the music had taken its seat. There was no body, no shadow of feet, but the air trembled the way air trembles above a weak fire, and the bagpipe sounded with such presence that the eyes almost deceived the heart. Myrene bowed her head in respect. She took up the flute and offered another melody. This time it was an air she had learned from a traveler from Yile, a tune that imitated the rocking of a small boat when the waves are short and the wind is asleep. She played softly, like someone stroking the mane of a horse. The answer was slow, and there was a smile in it. The bagpipe took the air and widened it, carried it into a broader valley, as if it had been playing that same motif for many nights under the open sky. It added a few ornaments Myrene did not know. They seemed like bright little stones in the back of a river. She memorized them, because there are gifts one receives with the fingers before the mind. When they finished, the silence that followed was not empty. It was a silence that wrapped around her, that warmed. "Ewan McRae," she said at last, naming him. If that is your name, or only the name we use from habit, thank you for your company." The green light trembled slightly, as if a leaf had shivered at the passing of an insect. Myron needed no more answer than that. She sat by the edge of the basin and let the minutes stretch out like a blanket. Again she thought of her grandmother, of the passing note, of the day she had found her crying quietly while putting away supplies, humming without realizing it. She would have liked to bring that memory into the cave and show it to the stone itself. "Look," she would have said, "there are tears in music sometimes, but they do not always mean sorrow. Sometimes they mean cleansing, like rain washing dust from a summer that lasted too long." She rose carefully, because the cold was beginning to steal her warmth, and said in a low voice, "I'll come back tomorrow if you don't mind." The bagpipe gave a single faint note, rising and dissolving into the stone. It sounded like consent. Maren smiled and turned back. She counted her steps, brushed the wall marks with her fingertips, passed the pool, and saw herself reflected in its dark sheet. And when she stepped outside, the afternoon greeted her with the smell of the tide returning. She walked back to her cottage feeling strangely light. The sky was a blue-gray plate, edged in pink to the west. Cormorants floated like ink marks over the water, and far away a sailboat drew in its sail without haste. In the village, Fergus greeted her with a lift of the chin. He asked nothing. Neither did she speak. They understood one another in the silence of those who know that some things break if too many words are laid upon them. That night, the peat fire crackled with ancient patience. Myron boiled water and brewed tea with mint leaves she had bought from a woman at the market. She opened her notebook and began to write. Not music yet. Words. The words one says to oneself in order to keep something from dissolving like mist. She wrote about the green light, the spiral pattern, the warmth in the wall mark. When she was done, she left the notebook open and leaned back in the chair, listening to the silence. Sleep came quickly, rocking her in the crackle of the fire, with the sensation that somewhere very far away, a bagpipe was practicing scales, as though trying different doors. At dawn, the sea smelled like bread. It was a strange scent, but sometimes the Atlantic gives it, a mixture of salt, wood, and something sweet that recalls old ovens. Maren woke before the gulls and went walking along the shore. The sand was cold, and the water brushed her ankles in a brief caress. There she met an older woman gathering seaweed into a wicker basket. She wore a red scarf on her head and had clear eyes, almost grey. "Good morning," said the woman. "I saw you yesterday going down to the rocks." "Good morning," Maren answered with a smile. "I went to listen." "And they listened to you," the woman said, as though it were not a question at all. "I knew it by the wind when I went home." A short, comfortable silence passed between them. The woman shook a strand of seaweed and added, "If you go back, take a handful of oats for the water, and if you see a light where you did not think there could be one, do not follow it too far. The sea here is generous, but it has pride as well. Give it something, and it always leaves something in return." Myren nodded. The woman introduced herself as Morag and handed her a small cloth bundle filled with raw oats. "So you won't think I'm asking something in return," she said. "I'll be the first to give." There was a spontaneous blessing in the gesture. Myren tucked the little bundle away and promised to repay it with bread or with news. She returned to the house, took her flute, and added a short cord to tie it around her wrist in case the cold made her clumsy and it slipped from her hand. Then she headed back to the cave at the hour when the tide was beginning to behave itself. She entered with the softness of someone who does not wish to wake a sleeping child. The air recognized her scent, or so it seemed, because the dampness no longer bit so sharply. She made her way to the chamber of spirals. Before playing, she scattered the oats into the basin. The grains swelled for a moment and then sank. The water did not change, but the light did. It grew a little brighter around the edges, as if the eye of the cave had blinked. Then Marin lifted a new tune, a simple one, 4 measures long, leaving space for the bagpipe to answer. And answer it did. It was like a dance of shadows and gleams, as though 2 dancers, each carrying their own age, were teaching one another steps. She learned an ancient turn that fell in the 3rd measure. He, or so she chose to believe, borrowed from her a breath that made the phrase open ahead of time, like a door pushed with the shoulder rather than the hand. Between melodies, Marin spoke a little, humbly, like someone talking to a river. She spoke of her grandmother, of the passing note. She spoke of Glasgow, of the sounds of the city, which are also music if one listens with respect. She spoke of people singing while hanging laundry. The bagpipe answered with an air that was pure calm. No lament this time, a present with no sharp edges. "I'd like," she said at last, not realizing her voice had slipped into something intimate. "I'd like to learn your song, the one that keeps you company when the fog comes down." A stretch of silence followed. The silence seemed to think. Then the drone returned, deep and resonant. The bagpipe began a slow melody, with wide intervals that opened the chest from within. Marin closed her eyes and followed it first with her heart, and only then with her fingers. She did not try to seize it all at once. She let the phrase unfurl the way ferns unfurl, slowly uncurling themselves. It was beautiful and ancient, and within it there was a place where it stopped and turned back upon itself like a spiral, a place for the passing note. At last she played it, afraid she might betray it. She did not betray it. Her humble flute returned to the bagpipe, a clear reflection. The cave seemed to nod with its walls, and when it was over, the air grew so still that Marin could hear her own heart. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll keep it safe." Before leaving, she tied a small blue ribbon in a crack in the wall, like the ribbons her grandmother used to tie to window latches so the wind could play with them. It was a tiny gesture, and I was here that asked for nothing in return. The bagpipe gave one final sound, so faint it might only have been a thought. The way back was brighter. When she emerged, the day had cleared completely, and over the water lay a low mist like a combed wool blanket. 2 seals lifted their heads near the breakwater, and if she had wanted to believe in signs, she would have said they smiled. Fraser, the baker, sold her a warm loaf, sprinkled with oats, and winked as he said, "To give back to the sea, if it asks." She laughed softly, and promised to save him a tune when he closed the oven. That afternoon, the girl wrote the melodies she had learned into her notebook. It did not come out exactly the same. Ancient melodies never allow themselves to be captured completely. But there was something faithful in the way she wrote it. The main curve, the turn in the 3rd phrase, and that secret place for the passing note. When she was done, she left the notebook open and rested her forehead on the back of her hand, breathing calmly. The fire, obedient as ever, kept its vow of warmth. As night fell, the fog rose from the bay with the delicacy of a cat entering a room where someone is asleep. Marin was no longer afraid. She opened the window and let the fresh air wash through the house. From far away, the bagpipe played 3 notes. She answered with 2, and the night, satisfied, closed its eyes. The fog lingered through the entire night, as if it wanted to stay and listen. The sea struck gently, in a long, sleepy rhythm. And now and then the sound of the bagpipe returned, distant, wrapped in vapor and salt. It was no longer a lament, but something more like an adagio, tenderly taking leave of a beloved visitor. Marin heard it in her sleep, without fear. In her mind, the notes and the wind mingled into a single soft current that finally carried her into deep rest. The next morning, the sun appeared filtered behind clouds, and the air bore that scent of earth and sea that announces calm after days of fog. The village woke slowly. Windows opened. Boats were prepared for fishing. A dog barked happily from the pier. Marin stepped outside with her notebook and the flute hanging from her neck. Her body felt light, as if the night had washed her thoughts as well. In the square she met Fergus again, the white-bearded old man. He was seated on a barrel, looking toward the horizon with the serenity of someone who has spent a lifetime measuring time by the movement of water. "Did you go back to the cave, lass?" he asked without taking his eyes off the sea. "Yes," she answered with a smile. "I think Ewan is no longer alone." Fergus nodded, as if the answer did not surprise him. "He always waits for someone with an awakened heart," he murmured, "not to frighten them, but to remind them." "To remind them of what?" she asked. The old man looked first to the heather-covered hills, then toward the rocks that formed the mouth of the bay. "That not everything that disappears is truly lost," he said. "Some sounds stay stored inside the stone, just as fire keeps the color of the hands that lit it." Marin thought about those words all day. She walked north along the path that climbed toward the abandoned lighthouse. From there, the view opened wide and clear, the sea stretching all the way to the bend of the horizon, gulls suspended in the air, the echo of the surf rising between the cliffs. She lifted her flute and played a short melody, just for herself. The wind carried it downward, toward the caves, where the piper slept in his musical eternity. That afternoon, the young woman visited Morag, the red-scarved woman. She found her in her cottage, drying seaweed beside the fire. "I was expecting you," Morag said, offering her a cup of dark tea. "When someone leaves oats to the sea always lets someone know." Marin smiled, a little embarrassed. "I'm not sure I did the right thing," she admitted, "but I felt that I had to." "You did well," the woman replied. "The old people used to say the sea and music are siblings. Both of them change without ceasing to be themselves. And when a soul becomes trapped between the two, it needs someone to remind it of the way back." "And do you think that's what I did?" Morag nodded slowly. "Maybe. Or maybe he was the one reminding you." The fire crackled, and for a long while neither of them spoke. The sound of the wind slipping down the chimney filled the room with a hypnotic murmur. Marin felt at peace, though she could not stop thinking about what she had seen in the cave. The spirals in the rock, the green light, the sense of presence without a body. It all seemed to belong to a dream, and yet every detail remained in her memory with almost physical clarity. Who was Ewan McGray, really? She finally asked. Morag adjusted her headscarf while looking into the fire. They say he was the son of shepherds from inland, a good lad, cheerful, with music that could make birds cry. But they also say his bagpipe came from a place where men ought not buy instruments, a relic of the northern Seath, given as a favor in exchange for a promise. A promise? Yes, that his music would never cease to sound, not even after his death. Hikim, silence that followed held the gentle weight of ancient truth. Myrene shivered, not with fear, but with reverence. She understood then that the story was not only a legend. It was a way of explaining how a musician's soul can cling to the air, like perfume held in cloth. That night, Myrene returned to the cave once more. She carried a lantern, her flute, and a small offering, a piece of oat bread wrapped in cloth. She entered slowly, letting her footsteps merge with the murmur of the sea. When she reached the chamber of spirals, she placed the bread beside the basin, as one leaves a flower on a grave without sorrow. "I haven't come to play tonight," she said softly, "only to listen." The air seemed to be waiting for her. At first there was nothing, only the drip of water and the distant creak of waves. Then, from some deep place within, the bagpipe began to sound. This time it was different, a gentler air, almost joyful, like a luminous farewell. Myrene sat down on the ground and closed her eyes. The music filled the cave with impossible clarity. Each note seemed to open a memory, not only hers, but the memory of the place itself. The turning of seasons, the tides, the years layered one over another like wind. When the melody ended, Myrene thought she heard a sigh. The lantern light trembled, and for a moment she believed she saw a figure, a young man with dark hair, a bagpipe hanging from his shoulder, looking at her with gratitude. His eyes were not sad. They were calm, like the sea in still weather. Myrene did not move. She did not want to break the delicacy of the moment. The spectre, or the memory, or the echo, inclined his head as one musician greets another. Then, slowly, the figure dissolved into mist, and the light returned to its usual tone. Only the sound of the sea remained, constant and eternal. Myrene breathed deeply. She knew what she had seen was no dream. Something had changed in the cave, and in her as well. The air felt cleaner, as if the place had released an old burden. "Rest," she whispered. "Your music is still alive." She walked out slowly, letting the waves accompany her. Outside, the sky was clear for the first time in many days. The stars trembled above the water, and the entire bay seemed to be holding its breath. In the distance, one final note of bagpipes drifted on the wind, so soft it seemed to rise from the heart of the sea itself. Days passed, and Myrene stayed in the bay a while longer. She wrote new melodies inspired by the caves and the waves. The fishermen began calling her the Piper's Girl, and some said that ever since she arrived, the nights had been calmer and the storms less fierce. Sometimes at twilight, she played from the beach and heard the echo answer from the rocks in a deep, beautiful tone, as if Ewan were still beside her, guarding the bay with his invisible music. One autumn day, Myrene decided to return to Glasgow. Before leaving, she walked to the cave one last time. The tide was low, and the air smelled of fresh seaweed. She placed her flute on the sand for a moment and looked out toward the horizon. "Thank you," she said with a quiet smile, "for teaching me how to listen." Then, very far away, a bagpipe sounded once more. 3 notes, the same 3 from that first night. Myrene answered them with a soft whistle, and the wind carried it out to sea, toward the place where music never goes silent. Even now, when fog falls over Clanyard Bay and the wind blows down from the hills, fishermen claim they hear a duet. Ewan McCrae's bagpipes and Marin's flute. Two souls playing together to keep the memory of the sea alive. And anyone who walks along the beach on those nights, if they listen carefully, may feel that earth and water are breathing in the same rhythm, inside a melody that belongs to no single time, because it is made of all of them. The melody of Clanyard, the melody of the piper who found rest in being heard, the melody of the girl who learned that listening is also a way of playing. Winter came to Clanyard on quiet feet, like an old man who does not wish to wake anyone. Frost covered the hills, and the morning smelled of wood smoke and freshly baked bread. The sea, however, remained the same, immense, patient, breathing beneath the fog. Though Marin had returned to Glasgow, her presence had not fully vanished from the bay. The villagers said that on certain dawns, when the light was pale and the waves looked half asleep, one could see the silhouette of a woman walking by the water, playing a flute no one heard, and yet everyone believed they did. Some thought it was a memory, others a dream dreamt by the sea. Fergus, seated by his fire, simply said, "The piper no longer plays alone." In Glasgow, the city breathed in another way. The streets were filled with noise and hurried steps, and sounds blended into a different kind of music. The rattle of trains, the murmur of conversations, the electric hum of lights. Myrene missed the deep silence of Clanyard, the rhythm of the sea, that cave where the air itself had seemed to possess a soul. Still, on nights when everything grew still, she would open her notebook and reread the notes of the melody she had learned from the piper. She played it on her flute with tenderness, and her room filled with a peace that did not seem of this world. Sometimes, when she finished, the echo of the sound returned to her like a sigh from far away, as though the Atlantic wind had come to visit only to hear her play. It was on one of those nights that her most beautiful composition was born, a piece she called The Lament of the Bay and its Reply. It was not a lament in the sorrowful sense, but a song of call and answer, where the low notes were the voices of the sea, and the high notes belonged to the wind moving through the hills. The piece grew slowly, with pauses that breathed, and ended with the passing note that bounded to Ewan's melody. She performed it for the first time in a small university hall. The audience listened in silence, hardly moving. When she finished, there was no immediate applause, only a long and profound silence, like the stillness left behind by prayer. Then, one by one, they began to clap. But Myrene was not thinking of them. She was thinking of the sea striking the rocks, of the green air of the cave, of the young piper bowing his head with quiet serenity. Years passed. Myrene became a respected composer, known for melodies inspired by old legends. But she never wrote anything that did not carry a little of Clanyard in its notes. Every piece, every pause, held an echo of that bay, a shadow of bagpipes accompanying her invisible flute. One spring, many years later, she decided to return. The train took her as far as Stranraer, and from there she walked the old paths toward the sea. The air still smelled of heather and salt, and the waves kept their same measured voice. In the village, almost no one recognized her, but Fergus, now very old, was still alive. When he saw her enter the tavern, he stood with effort and smiled. "I knew you'd come back, lass," he said. "Anyone who listens always returns here." Myrene sat beside him, and for a moment the two of them remained silent. like old friends who need no words to understand each other. "Can he still be heard?" she asked. "Yes," Fergus replied. "Not as often as before, but when the fog comes down and the sea is calm, he sounds again. And sometimes, if the wind blows from the east, there are 2 bagpipes." She smiled. "One bagpipe and 1 flute," she corrected gently. The old man let out a soft laugh. "Maybe so, but I'll tell you this, Merrin. It doesn't sound sad anymore. Ever since you left, the music has a different tone. Warmer, as if someone had taught the sea how to smile." That evening, Marion went down to the bay alone. The sun was sinking, and the sky was filling with rosy reflections. The tide was low, and the sand gleamed like old silver. The cave entrance was still there, just as before, though the seaweed had grown and the rocks looked darker. She walked slowly, her heart at peace. She carried no lantern, no notebook, only the flute, which had aged alongside her. She entered without fear, guided by the soft shafts of sunset light filtering in. The cave recognized her. The air moved just slightly, like a greeting. She reached the chamber of spirals, still untouched. The design of shells and crystal glimmered faintly, and the water in the basin was so still, it looked like a mirror of time. Marion sat before it and waited. For a few minutes, all she heard was the drip of water. Then, from somewhere deep within, came a familiar sound. One long bagpipe note, sustained, as if crossing centuries. Marion closed her eyes, smiled, and answered with her flute. And so the final dialogue began. There were no words, only music. The melody they played together was both new and ancient at once. A fabric of air binding the visible to the invisible, the living to what endures. The bagpipe marked a slow rhythm full of resonance, and the flute danced around it, light and bright as foam skimming a wave. Marion did not know how much time passed. The music had no beginning and no end. When the final note faded, a shaft of green light crossed the cave, illuminating the spirals in the rock. In the reflection of the water, Marion saw 2 figures, herself, and beside her the young piper, looking at her with gratitude. He was smiling, and his bagpipe now hung silent, finally at rest. And then she understood. The promise had been fulfilled. The music had not gone out. It had simply found its echo, its companion, its second voice. "Thank you," Marion whispered. "You can sleep now." The figure nodded, the air filled with a soft glow, like an aurora at the bottom of the sea, and then everything dissolved into silence. Only the cave remained, the water, and the sound of the returning tide. When she stepped outside, the sky was covered in stars. The night was clear, and the wind blew in from the west, carrying with it a far-off murmur of bagpipe and flute intertwined. Marion stood still upon the rocks for a long moment, looking out at the line of the horizon. She felt no sadness, no melancholy, only the sense that something ancient had finally found rest. Back in the village, the tavern lantern was still lit. Fergus had fallen asleep in his chair beside the fire, and Morag, older now but still steady, was knitting by the window. When she saw Marion, she smiled. "You saw him, didn't you?" she asked. "Yes," Marion answered. "But he isn't bound here anymore. He's everywhere." Morag nodded slowly, and the 2 of them sat watching the fire. The sound of the sea entered through the half-open door, mingling with the crackle of the wood. In that instant, the whole village seemed to breathe in the same rhythm, as if the bay itself were sleeping a peaceful dream. From then on, the story of the phantom piper of Clanyard Bay changed. No one spoke anymore of curses or dangerous tunnels. The elders told children that when the fog comes down and the sea glows green, the piper plays to remind them that music can heal what silence has kept hidden for too long. And on quiet nights, if one listens carefully, a light flute can still be heard answering from the shore, like an echo of friendship crossing the centuries. So the circle closes. So the melody comes to rest in the bay where wind and soul become one another, and where every breaking wave seems to say, I am here, I am still singing. With the passing of the years, Clanyard Bay became once again what it had always been, a hidden corner of southern Scotland where sea and sky seemed to blend together. And yet something had changed in the soul of the place. Grey days no longer felt quite so heavy. Storms seemed shorter. And even the fishermen swore the sea had become more generous with their net. Perhaps it was only time passing, or perhaps, as Morag would say, when music reconciles with its own echo, everything around it falls back into order. Fergus died one winter, peacefully asleep beside the fire. On the table near him was a half-filled glass, and on a scrap of paper, a single phrase written in a trembling hand. Tonight, I have heard 2 bagpipes in the wind. No one wept bitterly. In the village, death had always been an old acquaintance, and the people knew that Fergus, in the end, had only followed the sound he had been waiting for all his life. Morag lived for several years more. Sometimes she walked down to the beach at dawn, knelt on the wet sand, and let a handful of oats fall into the water. She did it without words, with a quiet smile. For the sea and for the musicians, she would say. One summer, long afterward, a young tourist arrived in Clanyard with a backpack and a camera. He had read about the legend of the phantom piper in an old folklore book and wanted to see the place for himself. The villagers, kind but reserved, told him what they knew. The story of Ewan McRae, his disappearance in the caves, the arrival of Myrian, the flute player who had freed his music. The young man listened carefully, but he did not believe in ghosts. He liked stories for what they revealed about people, not for the miracles they described. And yet, that night, when he went down alone to the bay to take photographs of the moon over the sea, something made him stop. There was no wind, no one else was there, only the sound of the waves. Then, from far away, he heard a bagpipe note, clear and gentle, as if blown from inside a dream. A second note answered, lighter, with the timbre of a flute. They were not echoes from a radio, nor music from any passing boat. It was something pure, transparent, seeming to rise from the very heart of the earth. The young man set his camera aside and stood perfectly still, his breath suspended. The air smelled of salt and heather. The sea gleamed with a pale light. And there, in the middle of that immense silence, he heard a slow, beautiful melody that wrapped itself completely around him. He felt no fear. He felt a deep tenderness, a kind of nostalgia for something he had never lived. When the music ended, the sound dissolved into the wind, and only the waves remained, breaking softly against the rocks. Without thinking, the young man whispered, "Thank you." And in that moment, a light gust stirred his hair and carried with it one last echo, 3 short rising notes fading into the mist. When he returned to the village, he found a little girl playing a wooden flute outside the tavern. The melody was the same one he had heard in the bay. "Where did you learn that song?" he asked. The girl smiled without stopping her playing. My grandmother taught it to me, she replied. She says she learned it from another woman who came from the sea. The young man said nothing. He simply smiled and listened, letting the music fill the cobbled street. He understood then that in Clanyard, stories do not disappear. They change voices, they become melodies, and they go on living inside whoever has ears to hear them. When night covered the bay again, the wind blew softly over the hills. High on the cliff, where the ruins of the castle slept beneath lichen and stars, a sound rose once more. Bagpipes playing calmly, sweetly, without sorrow. And beside them, a second instrument, a flute answering with joy, as if the whole sea were smiling with every note. The echo climbed the hills, fell toward the waves, and wrapped the entire valley in an ancient peace. The fishermen still on the pier lifted their heads and fell silent. There was nothing to say. The piper and the flute player were playing once more, to remind the world that music born from the soul never dies. It only changes form. It becomes air. It becomes sea. It becomes story. The next morning, the bay woke beneath a sheet of light. The water reflected silvery tones, and the heather on the cliff seemed to vibrate with an invisible murmur. On a rock by the sea, someone had left a blue ribbon knotted there, moving gently in the breeze. The villagers saw it, and none of them touched it. They knew that some things must remain where the wind leaves them, so they can go on singing. And if you ever pass by Clanyard Bay, when the day is fading and the fog is slowly rolling in, stop for a moment, keep silent, and listen. Perhaps you will hear the bagpipe, perhaps the flute, perhaps both. And if you do, do not be afraid. Just smile as Marin did, and let the music walk beside you for a little while. Because in that corner of Scotland, between the murmur of the sea and the scent of heather, there still lives a melody that never grows tired of playing itself. The melody of the phantom piper of Clanyard Bay, and of the woman who listened to him with an open heart. And as long as someone remembers, the wind will go on singing.